Welcome back to our channel and the final installment of our series on the 6 essential elements of successfully selling a business, the closing and its aftermath. So after months, sometimes years of preparation, marketing, buyer meetings, negotiations, due diligence, etc., closing day finally arrives. Documents are signed, money changes hands, high fives all around the table. And now, for you, it's on for something else. Well, maybe not. Because it's very likely that your deal requires you to hang around for a while. I'm Joe Caffrey, president of Worldwide Business Brokers, a company that I founded in 2001. And in this video, we're going to discuss the closing of the deal, the transition, and the inevitable aftermath. So over the last several videos, we've covered preparation and planning of not only the business, but also of the seller, of the owner of the business, listing and marketing, and how important the marketing materials are to the smoothness and eventual success of the selling process. Receiving and negotiating offers, due diligence, how to prepare and prepare yourself for that, and deal structure, how to set the deal up so that you walk away with the largest possible return for the work that you've put in. Now, each of these steps were designed to get us to where we are now. But despite all of the work that's already been done to get here, a surprising number of deals still fall apart before they reach the finish line. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions sellers have is that once the due diligence is complete, well, the deal is done. Not quite. The period between due diligence and the actual closing can be incredibly frustrating and incredibly busy and incredibly fraught that the deal might collapse. Think of it as kind of like planning for a wedding. At the time of this recording, my daughter got married about 6 weeks ago. My wife and I prepared for months. The wedding was to be held on our property, out in the open. My wife was so concerned about the thing that we could not control, and that was the weather. But that aside, everything we were doing was to prepare for a fabulous time, and it took us months to get to the week before the wedding. Tents were going up, caterers were showing up, but there were still the questions. Who's taking care of the alcoholic beverages? Who's taking care of the chairs? Who's doing this? Where's the preacher? Etc., etc., etc. The closing of a business is similar, very confusing, and very, very stressful. We've seen situations where financing approvals arrived at the last possible minute, where a landlord suddenly changes a term in the lease, and they won't agree to assign the lease without that term being agreed to. A customer unexpectedly cancels a major contract. Inventory counts don't match up. Now, most of these issues can be resolved, but they create stress, and that's what you need to prepare for. And this is why it's worth remembering something that we've been preaching throughout this series. Make it easy for the buyer to buy, because the more organized and transparent you are from the beginning, the fewer surprises you'll encounter at the end. Now, notwithstanding all of that, closing day arrives. Now, years ago, everybody gathered around a conference room table, but today, most closings happen remotely. Documents are signed digitally, funds are transferred electronically, and sometimes the parties don't even meet in person. But regardless of how it happens, the objectives remain the same. You want to transfer ownership, transfer funds, and transfer responsibilities. And once those documents are signed and the funds are transferred, ownership officially changes hands. But many first-time sellers don't understand that closing transfers ownership, transition transfers value. The buyer may now own the business, but whether the buyer receives full value what they paid for it often depends on what happens next. And that's where the transition period comes in. Many transactions require the seller to remain involved for months and occasionally for years, a condition of the deal that is generally negotiated during the due diligence period as a way for the buyer to protect the value they're about to acquire. Many of the deal structures we discussed in the previous video directly impact what happens during the transition period. So let me give you a couple of examples. Let's start with earnouts. Let's imagine that you've negotiated an earnout because you believe the business has some significant near-term upside potential and you want to be paid for it. The buyer says, well, if the business performs the way you believe it will, we'll happily pay you the additional purchase price. But if part of the justification for that higher price is your expertise or your customer relationships or your reputation, the buyer is likely going to insist that you stick around for a while. In effect, you're saying, pay me more because I know this business is going to experience a handsome growth revenue shortly. The buyer is responding by saying, well, fine. Then stick around and prove it. Earnouts often involve employment agreements, consulting agreements, transition services agreements, performance milestones. You may have sold the business, but operationally, you're still very much involved. But the same thing often occurs when seller financing is involved. Remember from the last video that when a seller financing is involved, the seller isn't simply the seller anymore. They've also become a lender. And lenders tend to take care, and they care very much about how their borrowers are performing. And in this situation, the lender, the seller, has a strong incentive to help the buyer succeed. Now, escrows and holdbacks are another type of post-closing involvement. Many sellers think escrows are simply delayed payments. They're not. They're risk management tools. The buyer may hold back 10 or 15% for a year or more to ensure that customer contracts remain intact, financial statements prove to be true, tax liabilities don't emerge out of the blue, representations and warranties, the stuff that you promised, are true. The release of those funds may depend on certain milestones being reached or certain problems not occurring. This means sellers often remain deeply involved with the business and particularly the ongoing health of the business. Another major objective of the transition period is transferring relationships. Many business owners underestimate the importance of this. The buyer may have purchased all of the assets, the furniture, fixtures, and equipment, all the inventory, all the IP, contracts, etc., but the seller still owns something far more valuable: trust. Customers trust the seller. Employees trust the seller. Suppliers trust the seller. Those relationships may have taken years to build. They don't automatically transfer at the closing. They can't. The seller's role during the transition is often to transfer the trust to the new owner, but this takes time. All of this creates one of the most difficult challenges for sellers. How do you help without interfering? We've seen many sellers who generally wanted to assist their buyers, but micromanaging the buyer's decisions is a recipe for disaster. At some point, the buyer has to be allowed to run the business, and they may run it differently. One of the hardest things former owners experience is watching someone else make decisions that they would never make if they were still the owner. At some point, though, the seller must transition from operator to advisor, and eventually from advisor to observer. Now, transitioning a business from one owner to another is going to be fraught with emotion. For years, sometimes decades, you've been the top dog, the decision maker, the guy that or the gal that everybody goes through to make decisions. Who sets the direction of the company? Where are we going to be in 90 days? What's the plan for this year, boss? What's the plan for this next product, boss? You're the person that everybody has turned to for years. And then suddenly, you're not. This is very often an extremely difficult adjustment and a strong source of seller regret, because you're giving up that top dog role. You're giving up control. Seller regret is a real thing. I know it because I experienced it myself. In the late 1990s, I sold a business that I'd started about 6 years earlier, and that business wasn't for sale. An investment group approached me. We'd like to buy your business. I told them politely, well, the business isn't for sale. And they said, well, everything is for sale. And so they continued to contact me, continued to come back, and eventually they illustrated the truth of that old saying, everything is for sale. Now, for years, I had gotten up at about 5:45, made some coffee, read a couple of newspapers, checked my email, and got into the office at about 7:30, a little bit before everybody else. But this closing happened on a Monday evening. We were in my office about 9:30, everything concluded in my conference room. The attorneys were there. Everybody kind of high-fived at the end. And on the way home, I wasn't sure. I was kind of in a haze. I wasn't sure I wasn't sure of the magnitude of what happened and what I had just done and how it would impact the rest of my life. And I realized that it may have been the last time that I left that parking lot. Next morning, I got up at 5:45, made some coffee, read 2 newspapers, checked my email, and panicked. I had nothing to do, nowhere to go, and no one to speak to about this. It was a very, very rough and challenging couple of weeks, maybe even couple of months. Business owners, we're doers. We're problem solvers. Our businesses aren't simply what we do. They're who we are. A business owner's identity, particularly the owner's self-identity, is very often tied to the ownership of their business. Then one day that identity disappears. 2 days after the closing on my business, I was in the grocery store in the evening and I ran into a friend that I've known for years. And she asked me, as one would, "How are you doing?" And I stumbled for a minute and I just blurted out, "I just sold my business." I wasn't sure how to follow that up, and she wasn't sure how to respond other than say, "Well, congratulations." Assuming, of course, that congratulations would have been in order if that was what I was trying to do, but it wasn't. One day that identity disappears. So this brings us back to something we discussed in the first episode of this series. One of the most important questions every seller must answer is, what am I going to do next? Doesn't matter what it is. It could be volunteering, it could be starting a new business, it could be traveling around the world, which was my choice. The specific answer doesn't matter. What matters is having an answer. Now, throughout this series, we define success as selling within a reasonable time frame, achieving the highest realistic valuation for your business, obtaining the least oppressive terms during the negotiation process. But I'd add one more. A successful transaction should leave the seller excited about the future, not wondering what just happened. So the bottom line here is that closing the deal isn't the finish line. It's the transition point between one chapter and the next. Successful sellers prepare the business, the transaction, and themselves. Over the course of this Essential Elements series, we've covered preparation and planning, listing and marketing, offers and letters of intent and how to negotiate them, due diligence, deal structure, and now closing and understanding the aftermath. If you followed this entire series, you now understand more about selling a business than most owners who are currently actively trying to sell one do. Selling a business is almost certainly going to be the most significant financial event of your lifetime. Done properly, it can create tremendous opportunity. Done poorly, it can create equally tremendous frustration. My hope is that this series helps you achieve the former and avoid the latter. So if you found any value in this series, hit that like button. It'd help us out. And subscribe to our channel. And share it with another business owner that you know who just might be thinking about selling. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.